The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his protection officer, James Mitchell. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh rain from the night before. George had always been different from other royal children, not in the way the newspapers liked to write about, but in the quiet way he noticed things that others often missed. James had been protecting the young prince for 3 years now, and in that time, he had watched George grow from a curious 7-year-old into a thoughtful boy who asked questions that sometimes surprised even the adults around him. Today was no different as they made their way toward the main entrance where a small ceremony was scheduled to take place. The ceremony was nothing grand, just a simple recognition event for long-serving palace staff. Queen Elizabeth II had started this tradition years ago, believing that those who served the royal family with dedication deserved acknowledgement. George had asked to attend, which had surprised his parents, Prince William and Catherine, since it wasn't typically an event for children. As they approached the gathering, George noticed something that made him slow his pace. Among the uniformed palace staff and security personnel stood an elderly man in a slightly worn but carefully pressed Royal Guard uniform. The man's name tag read Thompson, and George could see that his hands trembled slightly as he held his ceremonial hat. What caught George's attention wasn't just the trembling hands, but the way the man stood slightly apart from the others. There was something in his posture that spoke of years of service, of pride mixed with the weariness that comes with age. The other guards, all younger and more rigid in their stance, seemed to form an unconscious barrier around the elderly guard, not out of malice, but simply because his slower movements disrupted their practiced formations. George had learned about respect and service from his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, during their private conversations in her study. She had told him stories of people who had given their whole lives to serving others, and how the greatest honor wasn't in receiving recognition, but in recognizing those who deserved it. As he watched Guard Thompson struggle to keep up with the formal positioning required for the ceremony, George felt something stir inside him that he couldn't quite name. The ceremony began with the usual formalities. Officials read names from a list, and each honoree stepped forward to receive their recognition. George watched as younger staff members moved with confidence, their steps sure and their smiles bright. When Guard Thompson's name was called, the elderly man took a careful step forward, his movement slower and more deliberate than the others. It was then that George noticed something that made his heart ache. As Guard Thompson moved toward the front, one of the younger guards instinctively stepped aside but did so with an expression that suggested impatience. It wasn't cruel or intentionally unkind, but it was the kind of thoughtless reaction that adults often have when dealing with someone who moves at a different pace. Guard Thompson had served the royal family for 42 years. He had started as a young man of 20, full of dreams and determination to serve his country and the crown. Over the decades, he had stood watch during countless ceremonies, had protected members of the royal family through various events, and had maintained his post with unwavering loyalty. Now, at 62, his body showed the wear of those years of service, but his dedication remained as strong as ever. The recognition he was receiving today was for his 4 decades of service, a milestone that few achieved. Yet as George watched, he could see that the moment, which should have been filled with pride, was tinged with something else. The elderly guard's eyes held a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as if he knew that his time of active service was drawing to a close. George's protection officer, James, noticed the young prince's focused attention on Guard Thompson. James had worked in royal protection for 15 years and had developed a keen sense for reading situations. He could see that George was processing something significant, and he wondered what was going through the young prince's mind. As the ceremony continued, George found himself thinking about his great-grandmother's words about service and dignity. Queen Elizabeth II had often spoken to him about how true nobility wasn't about titles or crowns, but about how one treated others, especially those who had given their lives in service. She had emphasized that the greatest leaders were those who recognized the value in every person, regardless of their position or circumstances. The more George watched Guard Thompson, the more he understood that this man represented something important. Here was someone who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting and serving others, who had stood at attention through countless hours, who had maintained his post with dignity and pride. Yet now, as his physical capabilities naturally declined with age, he seemed to be inadvertently pushed to the margins of the very institution he had served so faithfully. When the ceremony concluded, the various honorees began to disperse, some chatting with colleagues, others posing for photographs with family members. Guard Thompson stood alone for a moment, carefully placing his ceremonial hat back on his head and adjusting his uniform with the same precise movements that had defined his decades of service. George made a decision that would surprise everyone present and create a moment that would be remembered for years to come. He quietly excused himself from his protection officer's side and began walking toward Guard Thompson. James, initially confused by the young prince's sudden movement, quickly followed at a respectful distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but curious to see what George intended to do. As George approached, Guard Thompson noticed the young prince coming toward him and immediately straightened his posture, preparing to follow the proper protocols for interacting with a member of the royal family. His training kicked in despite his fatigue, and he stood ready to bow or salute as appropriate. But George had something entirely different in mind, something that would challenge the usual formalities and create a moment of genuine human connection that would touch everyone who witnessed it. The other guards, officials, and staff members began to notice Prince George's approach, and conversations gradually quieted as people turned their attention to see what was happening. In the growing silence of the courtyard, with the autumn sun casting gentle light across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle, a young prince was about to demonstrate a lesson in respect and humanity that would resonate far beyond that single moment. Guard Thompson's weathered hands instinctively moved to adjust his uniform as Prince George approached. After 42 years of service, the protocols were deeply ingrained in his muscle memory. He prepared to execute the formal bow required when greeting a member of the royal family, his body automatically straightening despite the ache in his lower back that had become his constant companion over the past few years. The courtyard had grown unusually quiet. Palace staff, other guards, and officials found themselves pausing their conversations and turning their attention toward the unexpected interaction unfolding before them. It wasn't uncommon for members of the royal family to interact with staff during ceremonies, but there was something different about the way young Prince George was moving with such purposeful determination toward the elderly guard. James Mitchell, George's protection officer, maintained his position at a respectful distance, but kept his eyes carefully trained on both the prince and the surrounding area. In his 3 years of protecting George, James had learned that the young prince often acted from a place of genuine curiosity and kindness, sometimes in ways that surprised the adults around him. Still, protocol required that James be ready to step in if the situation called for it. As George drew closer, he could see the details that distance had obscured. Guard Thompson's uniform, while impeccably maintained, showed the subtle signs of decades of use. The fabric had a particular kind of wear that spoke of countless hours of duty, of standing at attention through ceremonies, celebrations, and solemn occasions. The man's face, deeply lined but alert, held the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of dedicated service. What struck George most profoundly was something he saw in Guard Thompson's eyes. Behind the professional composure and the practiced readiness to follow protocol, there was a flicker of uncertainty. It was as if the guard was questioning whether he still belonged in this world that had been his entire adult life, wondering if his slower pace and trembling hands marked him as somehow less worthy of the respect he had earned through decades of faithful service. When George reached Guard Thompson, something unexpected happened. Instead of allowing the guard to bow to him as protocol demanded, George stopped directly in front of the elderly man and, in a gesture that surprised everyone watching, bowed deeply himself. It wasn't the slight nod of acknowledgement that royalty typically gave to staff, but a genuine, respectful bow that clearly conveyed honor and appreciation. The silence in the courtyard became profound. Guards who had been adjusting their uniforms stopped mid-motion. Staff members who had been gathering their belongings looked up in surprise. Officials who had been preparing to leave the ceremony found themselves frozen in place, witnessing something that defied the usual order of royal interactions. Guard Thompson's reaction was immediate and visible. His eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, his composed professional facade cracked slightly. In his 4 decades of service, he had bowed to countless members of the royal family, had shown respect and deference as was proper and expected. Never had a member of the royal family bowed to him. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the established order of things, that it took him several seconds to process what had just happened. After his bow, George straightened and looked directly into Guard Thompson's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was clear enough for those nearby to hear, and his words were simple but profound in their sincerity. He thanked Guard Thompson not just for his service to the crown, but for his dedication to protecting the royal family, including George himself. The young prince spoke about how he understood that guards like Thompson were the reason he could attend school safely, play in the palace gardens, and live his life without fear. But George didn't stop there. He continued speaking, and his words revealed a level of understanding that surprised even the adults who knew him well. He talked about how he had learned from his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, that true honor came from recognizing the sacrifice and dedication of others. He mentioned that he had been watching Guard Thompson during the ceremony and had seen something that he wanted to acknowledge. The young prince explained that he had noticed how Guard Thompson carried himself with pride despite his physical challenges, how he maintained his dignity and professionalism even when others seemed to overlook his contributions. George's words weren't delivered as a prepared speech, but came from a place of genuine observation and heartfelt appreciation. As George spoke, something remarkable happened in Guard Thompson's expression. The uncertainty and weariness that had been visible in his eyes began to give way to something else entirely. It was as if the young prince's words were reminding him of something he had begun to forget, his own worth and the value of his contributions. Tears began to form in the corners of the elderly guard's eyes, though his training kept him from allowing them to fall. The other guards who had been watching began to understand something important as well. They saw their colleague not as the slower, older man whose pace sometimes disrupted their formations, but as someone whose experience and dedication had earned him a respect that even a young prince recognized. The inadvertent barrier they had formed around Guard Thompson began to dissolve as they stepped closer, drawn by the sincerity of the moment. Prince George then did something that completely broke protocol and created a moment that would be talked about in palace circles for years to come. He extended his hand to Guard Thompson, not in the formal handshake of official ceremonies, but in the warm, genuine gesture of person-to-person connection. When Guard Thompson took the offered hand, George didn't shake it once and release it. Instead, he held the guard's trembling hand steady with both of his own, a gesture that spoke of support and recognition. The impact of this simple act rippled through everyone present. James Mitchell, who had seen many formal interactions between royalty and staff, felt something shift inside him as he watched his young charge demonstrate a level of emotional intelligence and compassion that many adults never achieve. The other staff members began to see Guard Thompson differently, recognizing in him not just a colleague whose best days were behind him, but a veteran whose contributions had shaped the very institution they all served. For Guard Thompson himself, the moment was transformative in ways that would become clear in the days and weeks that followed. The young prince's recognition hadn't just acknowledged his past service, it had validated his continued worth and dignity in the present. The trembling in his hands seemed less pronounced as he felt the steady warmth of George's gesture, and something in his posture began to straighten with renewed purpose. As the moment stretched on, other members of the palace staff began to approach, no longer seeing the interaction as something to observe from a distance, but as something to be part of. The ceremony that had formally ended was being transformed into something much more meaningful, a genuine moment of human connection and mutual recognition that transcended the usual boundaries of protocol and hierarchy. The transformation in the courtyard was immediate and profound. What had begun as Prince George's personal gesture of respect toward Guard Thompson was creating ripple effects that touched everyone present. Other staff members, who moments before had been preparing to return to their duties, found themselves drawn into the circle of warmth and recognition that the young prince had created. Sarah Chun, a palace administrator who had worked alongside Guard Thompson for 8 years, approached with tears in her eyes. She had always respected Thompson but had never taken the time to really acknowledge what his decades of service meant. Watching Prince George's genuine appreciation made her realize how often she had taken Thompson's presence for granted, how his steady reliability had become such a constant that she had stopped seeing the person behind the uniform. Guard Thompson, still holding the young prince's hands, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the physical warmth of human contact, though that was significant after so many hours of standing at formal attention. It was the warmth of being truly seen and valued, not for what he used to be able to do, but for who he was in this moment. The dignity that had been slowly eroding under the weight of his physical limitations was being restored by the sincere recognition of a 10-year-old boy who somehow understood things that many adults missed. James Mitchell, observing the scene from his position as George's protection officer, found himself reflecting on his own assumptions about protocol and hierarchy. In his years of training and service, he had learned to maintain professional distance and to treat interactions between royalty and staff as formal exchanges governed by centuries-old rules. Yet what he was witnessing challenged those assumptions in the most beautiful way possible. Prince George, still holding Guard Thompson's hands, began to speak again. This time, his words carried a question that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Guard Thompson to tell him about his first day of service at the palace. The question came from genuine curiosity, but it also served to shift the focus from Thompson's current limitations to the long journey of dedication that had brought him to this moment. Guard Thompson's voice was slightly hoarse when he began to speak, partly from emotion and partly from the effort of maintaining his composure. He told Prince George about arriving at the palace as a 20-year-old, full of nervous energy and determination to prove himself worthy of protecting the royal family. He described how overwhelming it had felt to walk through the ancient halls for the first time, knowing that he was becoming part of something much larger than himself. As Thompson spoke, his voice grew stronger and clearer. The memories seemed to energize him, reminding him of the passion and purpose that had driven him through 4 decades of service. He talked about the first time he had stood guard during a state dinner, how proud he had felt to be trusted with such responsibility. He mentioned the cold winter nights when he had maintained his post despite freezing temperatures, and the summer ceremonies where the heavy uniform had felt unbearable, but his commitment had never wavered. Other guards who had been watching began to gather closer, drawn by Thompson's stories and by the example Prince George was setting. Among them was Marcus Reed, a guard who was only 5 years into his service and who had sometimes felt impatient with Thompson's slower pace during formations. As he listened to the older guard's stories, Marcus began to understand the depth of experience and knowledge that Thompson represented. Thompson continued his story, describing how the palace had changed over the years, how he had served under different security protocols and had adapted to new technologies and procedures while maintaining the core values of duty and loyalty that defined the Royal Guard. He spoke about colleagues who had come and gone, about the satisfaction of knowing that his vigilance had contributed to the safety and security of the royal family through countless events and celebrations. Prince George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged Thompson to share more details about his experiences. The young prince wanted to know about the most challenging aspects of the job, about what had kept Thompson motivated through difficult times, and about what advice he would give to younger guards just starting their careers. These weren't the casual questions of a child trying to make conversation. They were the genuine inquiries of someone who recognized the value of Thompson's wisdom and experience. As the conversation continued, something remarkable happened among the other palace staff and guards. They began sharing their own memories of working with Thompson, stories of times when his experience had been invaluable, moments when his steady presence had provided comfort during stressful situations. What emerged was a picture of a man whose contributions went far beyond the formal duties outlined in his job description. Marcus Reed spoke up about a time during his first month of service when he had made a serious error in protocol. Instead of reporting the mistake to supervisors, Thompson had quietly taken the young guard aside and helped him understand how to correct the error and prevent it from happening again. Thompson's mentorship had not only saved Marcus from disciplinary action but had helped him develop into a more confident and competent guard. Sarah Chen shared her memory of a particularly chaotic day when multiple events were happening simultaneously at the palace. While everyone else was focused on their specific responsibilities, Thompson had been the one to notice that an elderly visitor was becoming overwhelmed and disoriented. He had quietly stepped away from his post to help the visitor find her way, ensuring her comfort and dignity while maintaining the security of the event. These stories revealed Thompson not just as someone who had fulfilled his duties, but as someone who had consistently gone beyond what was required, always with a focus on service to others rather than personal recognition. The pattern of quiet excellence that emerged from these memories painted a picture of true professionalism and dedication that commanded respect. Prince George, listening to these stories, felt a deep sense of satisfaction that his instincts had been correct. He had sensed something special about Guard Thompson, and the stories being shared confirmed that his recognition was well-deserved. More importantly, he could see how his simple gesture of respect was encouraging others to share their appreciation and to see Thompson in a new light. The conversation that had begun as a simple exchange between a young prince and an elderly guard was becoming something much more significant. It was becoming a moment of collective recognition, a time when an entire community of palace staff was rediscovering the value and dignity of one of their own. The hierarchies and formalities that usually defined palace interactions were giving way to genuine human connection and mutual appreciation. Guard Thompson, surrounded by colleagues sharing positive memories of their time working with him, felt a transformation taking place within himself. The sense of being a burden or an inconvenience that had been growing over the past year was being replaced by a renewed understanding of his worth and contribution. The trembling in his hands seemed less noticeable, his posture was straighter, and his eyes held a light that hadn't been there at the beginning of the ceremony. Word of the extraordinary moment in the courtyard began to spread throughout Windsor Castle with remarkable speed. Palace staff members who hadn't witnessed the interaction firsthand heard about it from colleagues, and each telling seemed to add another layer of meaning to what had occurred. The story wasn't just about Prince George's gesture of respect. It was becoming a tale about the power of recognition and the importance of seeing dignity in every person, regardless of their position or circumstances. Within hours, the story had reached Prince William and Catherine, who received a detailed account from James Mitchell, George's protection officer. William listened with a mixture of pride and amazement as James described how his son had instinctively understood something that many adults struggled with: the importance of honoring those who serve with dedication and humility. Catherine found herself deeply moved by the description of George's genuine interaction with Guard Thompson, recognizing in her son the compassionate heart they had tried to nurture. The impact on Guard Thompson himself was profound and immediate. For the first time in months, he walked through the palace corridors with his head held high, greeting colleagues with renewed confidence. The stories that had been shared in the courtyard had reminded him of his own worth and had given him a new perspective on his current role. Instead of seeing himself as someone whose best days were behind him, he began to understand that his experience and wisdom had value in the present moment. That evening, Thompson went home to his modest flat in Windsor and called his daughter, Margaret, who lived in Scotland with her family. For months, their conversations had been tinged with his growing concerns about his future, his worries about whether he was still useful in his position. Tonight, however, his voice carried a different quality as he told her about the ceremony and about Prince George's unexpected recognition of his service. Margaret had been worried about her father for some time. During recent visits, she had noticed that his usual pride in his work had been replaced by a kind of weariness that seemed to go beyond physical fatigue. She had encouraged him to consider retirement, thinking it might be time for him to step away from the demands of palace service. But, as she listened to him describe the day's events, she heard something in his voice that had been missing for months, a sense of purpose and renewed energy that surprised her. The story of Prince George's gesture also reached other members of the royal family. Queen Elizabeth II, when told about her great-grandson's spontaneous act of recognition, smiled with deep satisfaction. She had spent many hours with George, sharing stories about the importance of service and the value of treating all people with dignity and respect. To hear that these lessons had translated into such a genuine and meaningful action filled her with pride and hope for the future of the monarchy. In the days that followed, the dynamics within the palace guard began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Marcus Reed, the younger guard who had witnessed the interaction, found himself seeking out opportunities to learn from Thompson's experience. Instead of viewing the older guard's slower pace as an inconvenience, Marcus began to see it as deliberate and thoughtful, the measured movements of someone who had learned the value of doing things correctly rather than quickly. Other guards followed Marcus's example, and Thompson found himself in the unexpected position of being sought out for advice and guidance. Younger guards began asking him about proper protocols in unusual situations, about how to handle difficult visitors with grace, and about the traditions and history that gave meaning to their service. Thompson discovered that his knowledge and experience were not outdated relics, but valuable resources that could help shape the next generation of palace guards. The transformation wasn't limited to the guards themselves. Palace administrators and staff members began to approach Thompson differently, taking time to acknowledge his presence and to seek his input on matters where his long experience provided valuable perspective. Sarah Chun, The administrator, who had been moved by Prince George's gesture, made a point of consulting Thompson about security arrangements for upcoming events, recognizing that his decades of experience gave him insights that newer staff members might lack. Prince George, unaware of the full extent of the ripple effects his gesture had created, continued his normal routine of school and royal duties. However, his parents noticed subtle changes in how he interacted with palace staff. He seemed more attentive to the people around him, more likely to acknowledge service workers and guards with genuine appreciation rather than the polite but distant courtesy that had been his previous habit. During a family dinner several weeks after the ceremony, George mentioned Guard Thompson to his parents, asking if they knew how long he had been serving at the palace. When William told him about Thompson's 42 years of service, George expressed amazement that someone could dedicate so much of their life to protecting his family. The conversation that followed revealed how deeply the encounter had affected George's understanding of service and sacrifice. Catherine used the moment to discuss with George the broader implications of his gesture. She explained how his simple act of respect had not only honored Guard Thompson but had also reminded everyone present about the importance of recognizing the dignity and worth of all people. She helped George understand that leadership often meant seeing the value in others and helping them see it in themselves. Meanwhile, Guard Thompson was experiencing changes that went beyond his immediate work environment. His renewed sense of purpose had physical manifestations as well. The trembling in his hands, while still present, seemed less pronounced when he was engaged in meaningful work. His posture remained straighter throughout longer periods, and colleagues noted that he seemed to have more energy during his shifts. Thompson also began to take on informal mentoring roles with newer guards, sharing not just technical knowledge about procedures and protocols, but also wisdom about the deeper meaning of service. He talked about the honor of being trusted with the safety of the royal family, about the importance of maintaining dignity even during the most routine duties, and about how service to something greater than oneself could provide meaning and satisfaction throughout a career. The younger guards, initially surprised by Thompson's new visibility and engagement, quickly came to value his guidance. They discovered that his stories weren't just interesting anecdotes, but contained practical lessons about handling challenging situations, maintaining professionalism under pressure, and finding personal satisfaction in duty well performed. Thompson's experience became a bridge between the traditions of the past and the needs of the present. One particularly meaningful conversation took place between Thompson and Marcus Reed during a quiet moment while on duty. Marcus asked Thompson about how he had maintained his motivation through 4 decades of service, especially during periods when the work might have felt routine or unappreciated. Thompson's answer revealed the philosophy that had sustained him, the understanding that their work, while often invisible to the public, was essential to something much larger than themselves. Thompson explained to Marcus that every day he put on his uniform, he was not just going to a job, but was participating in the continuation of an institution that represented stability, tradition, and service to the nation. He helped Marcus understand that the significance of their work wasn't diminished by its routine nature, but was actually enhanced by the quiet consistency with which they performed their duties. 6 months after that September ceremony, Windsor Castle had become a different place for Guard Thompson and for many others who had witnessed Prince George's simple but profound gesture. The changes that had begun in those moments in the courtyard had continued to grow and spread, creating a culture of mutual respect and recognition that enhanced the working environment for everyone. Guard Thompson had not only maintained his renewed sense of purpose, but had exceeded even his own expectations for what his remaining years of service could accomplish. His role had evolved naturally into that of a senior mentor and advisor, a position that utilized his vast experience while accommodating his physical limitations. The palace administration, recognizing the value of his knowledge and the positive impact of his mentoring, had formally created a new position that allowed Thompson to share his expertise with newer guards while continuing to serve in a capacity that honored his decades of dedication. The transformation in Thompson's circumstances had also brought unexpected personal rewards. His daughter Margaret, who had previously worried about his declining enthusiasm for work, now looked forward to their phone calls because of the energy and satisfaction that came through in his voice. During her visits to Windsor, she could see that her father had rediscovered not just his professional purpose, but also a renewed joy in life that extended beyond his work duties. Thompson's grandchildren, inspired by stories of their grandfather's recognition by Prince George, had begun to understand their grandfather's work in a new way. Instead of seeing him simply as an elderly man with a job at the castle, they now recognized him as someone whose service was valued and respected by the royal family itself. This shift in perspective had strengthened family bonds and given Thompson a new source of pride in sharing his experiences. Prince George, now 11 years old, had continued to demonstrate the empathy and awareness that had characterized his interaction with Guard Thompson. His parents noticed that their son's understanding of his role and responsibilities as a future member of the monarchy had deepened considerably. The experience had taught him that true leadership often meant recognizing and elevating others rather than simply commanding respect for oneself. During subsequent palace events and ceremonies, George made a point of acknowledging staff members and guards in ways that were appropriate to his position, but clearly influenced by what he had learned from his interaction with Thompson. His greeting to palace staff became more personal and genuine, and he often asked about their families or remembered details from previous conversations. These small gestures, while maintaining proper protocol, created an atmosphere of mutual respect that enhanced the working environment throughout the palace. The story of George's gesture had also reached beyond the immediate palace community. Through discreet channels, word of the young prince's recognition of Guard Thompson had spread among royal protection services and palace staff at other royal residences. The story had become a quiet legend of sorts, an example of how genuine leadership could manifest itself even in someone so young. Other members of the royal family, learning from George's example, began to pay closer attention to the long-serving staff members who had become almost invisible fixtures in their daily routines. This renewed attention to recognizing service and dedication created a positive feedback loop throughout the royal household, where staff members felt more valued and, in turn, took even greater pride in their work. Guard Thompson's influence on younger guards had grown significantly over the months. His informal mentoring had become so valuable that several guards specifically requested to work shifts with him whenever possible. These guards discovered that Thompson's 4 decades of experience had given him insights into human nature, crisis management, and the subtle aspects of providing security that couldn't be learned from training manuals alone. One particularly meaningful development occurred when Marcus Reed, the guard who had initially been impatient with Thompson's slower pace, was promoted to a supervisory position. One of Marcus's first actions in his new role was to recommend that Thompson be officially recognized as a senior training advisor. This recommendation, supported by testimonials from multiple guards who had benefited from Thompson's guidance, led to Thompson receiving an additional honor and a formal acknowledgement of his mentoring contributions. The ceremony for this new recognition was small and private, attended only by immediate colleagues and supervisors. However, Prince George, having heard about the event through his parents, asked if he could attend. His presence at Thompson's second recognition ceremony created another powerful moment, as the young prince once again took the opportunity to express his appreciation for Thompson's continued service and his new role in training the next generation of guards. During this second ceremony, George's words revealed how much his own understanding had grown over the past months. He spoke not just about Thompson's individual service, but about what Thompson represented in terms of institutional knowledge and the importance of passing wisdom from one generation to the next. The young prince's comments demonstrated a mature understanding of how organizations and institutions maintain their strength and effectiveness through honoring their experienced members while welcoming and training newcomers. Thompson's response to this second recognition was markedly different from his reaction 6 months earlier, where once he had been surprised and emotional at receiving unexpected acknowledgement. He now accepted the honor with quiet dignity and confidence. His speech thanked not just the royal family, but also his younger colleagues who had reminded him that his experience had value and that his continued contributions were welcome and needed. The broader impact of these events continued to resonate throughout the palace community. Staff members who had witnessed both ceremonies found themselves more attentive to their colleagues' contributions and more likely to express appreciation for good work and dedication. The culture shift that had begun with a 10-year-old prince's spontaneous gesture of respect had evolved into an ongoing commitment to recognizing and valuing all members of the palace community. Sarah Chun, the administrator who had been moved by the original interaction between George and Thompson, had implemented new procedures for acknowledging staff achievements and celebrating service milestones. These initiatives, inspired by what she had witnessed, ensured that future recognition would be more systematic and that long-serving staff members would receive appropriate appreciation before reaching retirement. As the first anniversary of the original ceremony approached, Thompson reflected on the remarkable changes that had occurred in his life and work. From feeling like he was becoming a burden on his colleagues, he had transformed into a valued mentor and advisor whose experience was actively sought out and appreciated. The trembling in his hands had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him or limited his sense of usefulness. Most significantly, Thompson had rediscovered the joy and meaning that had originally drawn him to palace service 4 decades earlier. The young man who had once walked through the palace gates full of nervous determination to serve had evolved into an elder statesman whose wisdom and experience enriched the lives of everyone around him. The circle of service had been completed not through retirement, but through a renewed understanding of how experience and dedication could continue to contribute value in new and meaningful ways. Prince George's quiet gesture had ultimately demonstrated that true nobility lies not in commanding respect, but in recognizing the dignity and worth of others. In honoring Guard Thompson, the young prince had not only transformed one man's final years of service, but had also created ripple effects that strengthened an entire community and established a legacy of recognition and appreciation that would continue long after both he and Thompson had moved on to new phases of their lives. The lesson that a 10-year-old prince had intuitively understood, that seeing and honoring the value in others is one of the highest forms of leadership, had become a guiding principle that would influence palace culture for years to come.